Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Folco, Schreiber Curator at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, Hagerstown, Maryland. I am returning to share with you this evening part two, dedicated to the art of William H. Singer Jr., founder of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. This two-part series is organized in order to recognize the museum's 90th birthday this year, having been founded in 1931 by William and his wife, Anna. And we're going to pick up where we left off last time. I will say that if you haven't had a chance to check out part one yet, I encourage you to do so. The video is available on the web, and I believe also on our YouTube page. So please join me this evening for a very interesting exploration of this artist's work. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge our sponsors for this evening's program, Mr. and Mrs. James and Holtzapfel. We thank you very much for your support. And this story goes back to the heart and the core of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, which opened its doors in 1931. It had been founded in the later years of the Depression between 1928 and 1929. Now, in the first program, last time we talked a bit about the background of the singers, talked about their lives, how they met one another. Tonight, I'm not going to go back and go over all of that because you can explore that on your own. But I would like to look at basically the second half of William Singer's career. As I mentioned last time, he was born in Pittsburgh in 1868. His father was a steel magnate. He became interested in art at a young age. But for William, it was art that attracted him, not finances and running the family's business. So what he decided to do was to sit down and study art on a more formal basis, but to dedicate his entire life to the study of painting and to immersing himself in nature, which is what we're going to explore tonight. As I also explained last time, the Singers became expatriates in Europe, and specifically, they lived between the Netherlands and Norway. But tonight, we're going to be not looking so much at their lives in the Netherlands, but rather their experiences in Scandinavia and specifically in Norway. The Singers really did move around quite a bit. They only went back to the United States occasionally in their lifetimes. And William, at a certain point, particularly after the 1920s, did not go back at all for a number of reasons, particularly his ailing health. Very significantly, though, in 1931, the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts is officially launched. And with that comes the collection of the Singers. Here is a close-up here of the newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, dated 1932, in which they reviewed the newly opened museum, and which contained works by various artists, none other than, of course, William Singer himself. Now, I will say that his work did not come until 1932. We'll see which one specifically this evening. But prior to that, it was primarily the collection of European and American art formed by the Singers, as well as a group of Asian objects that was part of that founding gift. But as time went on, more art would be added to the collection by William Singer himself. As I also mentioned last time, this author, R.W.P. de Vries, who was an important acquaintance, a friend of the Singers. He was an artist himself, but primarily an art dealer and a publisher. This Dutch gentleman, who's pictured here on the left, basically authors the first monograph of William H. Singer. He was also an art critic. He looked very favorably upon Singer's work, and he helped to promote his reputation in a number of ways. He collaborated both with the artist and also the Singer's dealer, who not only represented William at his gallery in Amsterdam, his name is Franz Buffa, but also he procured works of art of different periods and cultures for the Singers. So William Buffa is very critical here, as is R.W.P. de Vries, who really was the first to pull all this work together up until the publication of this book, which occurred in the 1920s. It was published, I believe, between the 20s and the 30s. Now, since then, many individuals have written about William Singer, most notably Helen Tretlin, who is a Dutch art historian. Quite some time she worked at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Also, some of my predecessors, including Robert Pressler, who used to be curator of the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts between the 70s and 80s, did important research and studying of Williams' works in our collection. Another person who made important contributions to the study of Singer is the famous William Kurtz, art historian and specialist in American art. Just to sort of place the artist in his context, Singer's artwork can be found in many collections throughout the US, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, and scattered in various places beyond that. And of course, in our two museums overseas, our sister museum, the Singer Lauren, which will be coming up tonight in our discussion, and also the West Norway Museum of Decorative Art, which is in Bergen, Norway, and actually was the city to which the Singers traveled from the village of Alton, in which they primarily lived. It was the closest large city. Important influences on Singer, who basically is very difficult to categorize as an artist because he formulated his own style in which he synthesized different elements of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism and basically found his own manner of painting, one that takes a little bit from pointillism and a little bit from Impressionism and a little bit from Post-Impressionism and pulls that together, both in a European sense and in an American sense. But one of his, in my view, one of his most important influences was the French late Impressionist, Henri Le Sidonet, who created this beautiful painting on the left called The Blue Table about 1923. Last time I talked a little bit about Sidonet. He will come up tonight. And here you can see a really nice set of photographs of the two artists. Here's William Singer on the right, and there's his French friend on the left. They had many interesting conversations with one another. They were co-represented by Franz Buffa, whom I mentioned before, and they exhibited together throughout Europe. Here you can see the mutual influence of Sidonet's technique of applying these dots of color to the surface of the canvas, using beautiful palette of pastels and sort of pulling all those elements together and imbuing the scene with this very subtle light, sometimes which shines down from outside the composition itself, but other times it sort of radiates within. That light that comes from within the painting is going to be an important part of William's work as time goes on. This you can see in a Dutch piece called My Garden Terrace from about 1912 and in the Museum of Decorative Art there in Bergen, Norway. Now, the Singers first traveled over to Norway in the very early 1900s, and these are some of those early works that William did. On the left are several photographs, one of which was a very interesting one there of William lighting up a pipe. He's sitting outside, and also there at his studio. And on the bottom, that is a cabin that they built that was located in the countryside, into which they retreated for part of their life. In those early years, though, he started painting in Oslo, the capital of Norway, the Sandvik River, which was quite popular among tourists and artists. Here's another one that he did of the Sandvik River. You can already see how he's interested in depicting the textures of the water. This being much more impressionistic than what you're going to see in some of the later works tonight that gradually become more pointillistic, depending on the subject he's looking at and the colors he's trying to incorporate into the composition. Here he's looking at the rushing qualities of the water, as well as the fleeting aspects of light across the sky. This being a very quick kind of sketch. And keep in mind that it's oil on panel. We'll return to that afterwards and explore why that's significant. Here's a map to orient you. Before I had mentioned, one of the primary residences of the Singers was in Laren. Today, that's a very well-to-do suburb of Amsterdam. And what the Singers would do is they would depart from one of the ports of the Netherlands, possibly from Amsterdam itself, take a boat, and they would come around here and arrive sometimes in Oslo, but other times they would arrive in not far here in Bergen, because both cities offered harbor, depended where they were going and what they were doing. A train could be caught from Oslo that would take them to Bergen, and from Bergen, what they would do is they need to travel by road to Olden. The excursions that the Singers embarked on did not take them to the very further flung locations of northern Norway, such as these up here, getting close to the Arctic Circle. But William did, and sometimes with Anna Singer, make excursions further to the east here, actually very close to the Swedish border, not far from the city of Trondheim. And this is very interesting because William did have a chance to explore a bit more of the country. Of course, because he was a bit older, he didn't go on expeditions, as I had mentioned, further north, getting up here, which might have also been at that time quite difficult because the roads were not what they are certainly by any means today. So the primary subjects for Singer here in Norway, not really places like Bergen, it was Olden, which is this village that's located here in the heart of a region called Nordfjord, or North Fjord, the fjord being those where the mountains meet water, either lakes or other sources of salt water, some of which are connected by rivers that eventually lead out to the Norwegian Sea. So this is their world in the early 1900s. By 1922, they are going to purchase a plot of land and build a house called Dalheim. Today, it's actually called Singerheim. This is their home. It also, I believe, had a guest house there. And as you can see, it is right below one of those steep mountains. William would also construct for himself a studio to which he could retreat. This is what it looks like today. As of several years ago, this house that was concerned to people who follow the Singers, and particularly William's art, because there was some talk in the village of Olden that it would be sold on the real estate market. And there's been a push, from what I understand, though I'm not fully up to date on all of the developments, there's been a push in Olden to keep this in the hand of perhaps the city government, or at least within the ownership of a preservation society, so that it doesn't get turned into a hotel or something like that, or worse, that it might vanish because the property could be acquired for the purpose. But as far as I know, you can still go there and visit it. I haven't gone myself, but it is on my list of things to do someday. It just looks like such an amazing site. Preserved within the Dalheim studio are some of Singer's paintings. There are some ceramics there that still remain. His easel, his brushes, many of his materials, oil paintings on canvas, as well as pastels, another one of his favorite media. For William, though, his preferred medium was oil on canvas, as you're going to see. One of the places that the Singers explored when they first got to Norway in the 1910s is the Tydal. And I had mentioned to you before that that's very close to the Swedish border. This is where Singer got his start in terms of exploring and falling in love with the Norwegian landscape, Tydal being close to Trondheim. So that's some distance from Olden, and it would have taken them quite some time to get there. And in the Tydal, he begins to make these gorgeous sketches. This one a pastel, and then the one in the center, landscape with birch trees. This is his introduction to the grand nature that is characteristic of Norway even to this day, very unspoiled. Part of what drove William to go here and to convince Anna to accompany him was that it couldn't be more the opposite of where he grew up in Pittsburgh. If you watch the first segment of this program that was recorded last month, you will discover that Pittsburgh was very polluted at the time. And this was something that Singer was trying to do. He was trying to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. In many ways, he was actually, in some ways, escaping from America and from industry in general. Now, during these years, that does not mean he did not go back to Larned, but I will say that William Singer did not prefer to spend most of his time in the city. As he gets older, he wants to be out there, absolutely enveloped in nature. And here in Norway, Scandinavia, this provides him the perfect opportunity to do so. This is what the Tydal looks like in a photograph. And here is that cabin that the Singers had there. In those early years, William and Anna would stay there, and he would be able to go out on these day excursions and bring with him his sketchbooks, but also his his panels on which he would make oil paintings. You have works that I mentioned last time, Winter Stream in Norway from 1911, Waterfall Gulpen, and then a brook in Norway. These date from this period. They're really beautiful works, not in the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts collections, but they are, however, in Sigarlaren and the West Norway Museum of Decorative Art. Also, as we're going through these, try to see how his style is changing, because at the beginning, it really is more in the tradition of American Impressionism, I will say that. And by that, I mean that he's still looking very much at the work and responding to work by, for example, Charles Assam or William Metcalf, whom we discussed last time. And he begins to sort of move away from this as time goes on, particularly as you're going to see once we hit the 1920s. But I am very fond of these paintings. September morning in Norway, where you have this early snow that's hit the ground. Look at how these colors, because the leaves have now fallen off the trees, contrast with the snow. This must have been quite something for a singer to see. This kind of snowfall, this time of the year, you won't really see that in most places in America unless you go to very high elevations. Morning mist again, the tie-dye. Look at the atmospheric perspective here, the billowing clouds, the mists, the fog that rises above this mighty mountain. Or River Rapids near Gayendesheim, a charcoal and pastel composition in which he focuses our attention on the water during probably would appear to be here either springtime or perhaps the summer, but on a very overcast day. I had said before that Willard Metcalf was an important influence on William. That's certainly the case with these early ones. And actually, Willard Metcalf came over and visited the Singers, stayed with them and vacationed there. And look at how similar these compositions are of Summer Evening in 1913 and the Salmon River, also by Metcalf over here, very close in terms of the use of the colors, the building up of the composition as a whole, the snow-peaked mountains. It all speaks to a mutual exchange of techniques and ideas. But notice how Singer sort of pronounces the foliage more here. You can see how he's focusing on the use of these blues and greens, whereas here it's purely green for Willard Metcalf. This will be a precursor to the kinds of colors and the layering of those textured paint applications that William will explore in the works of the 20s and 30s. During the 1910s, it's important to mention that the Singers could not return to Holland. And that's because it was occupied by German forces in World War I, and therefore they stay in Norway. The stay in Norway has the positive effect of keeping William's interest in Scandinavia and really encouraging him to soak up all of these natural surroundings that he has. In this one here, probably from the late 1910s, shows him really delving into this grand nature. This is the Jotunheimen, which is a park that's not too far off here from Trondheim, one of the natural parks. And notice he uses a mountain goat. This is something that we don't really see with William here. He is not an artist who incorporates, by any sense of the imagination, people or even animals. This is a sort of a one-off for him. It is purely about natural elements. And in that sense, no animals, particularly once he gets to Norway. Now, we did see in the last presentation that Singer did incorporate sheep into his early works. That's particularly because he was under the influence of the Laren school of Dutch artists. But this is more of an anomaly. Look at these trees, too. These are just stunning. Another sort of anomaly in his work at this time are a series of still lifes. These are called Intermezzi, which sort of bring to mind actually musical elements when we think of an intermezzo, very famously played by composers such as Johannes Brahms. But here they are done in paint, and they reflect and parallel the Singer's interest in collecting decorative arts, and also show the influence of artists in the Singer's circle, such as particularly Jacob Doyevard, their live-in friend of many years, and whose art I'm very fond of. This still life from 1929 that's in our collection, very much realistically rendered, but very interestingly, and as Helen Tretlin has pointed out in her book, James Ensor may have been an influence on William Singer with his, for example, still life with chinoiserie, or westernized depictions of Chinese or Asian subjects. This is really interesting to look at because it seems from this that Singer, like James Ensor, a very unusual and sometimes eccentric Belgian artist who was Singer's contemporary, both of them are influenced by this Asian art, and particularly Japanese prints that you see here used by James Ensor. There's also a fan. And then all of these Chinese objects that are placed on a table very carefully. But at the same time, there's sort of colors in the green, the blues, the tan in the background. The coloring is a bit jarring. It's almost as if we have arbitrary colors that are pulled together here. William is similarly in the Intermezzi still lifes, doing the same thing. He's got pink, he's got blue. This might not actually be the color of a parrot in real life. He's exaggerated it. I find that very fascinating because we see that in the work, for example, of artists like Pierre Bonnard, who comes a bit earlier than this, but he's still working through the early 1900s. And notice one of Singer's paintings of the village of Alton is incorporated into the background with this elaborate tablecloth and or drape. And you also have flowers. This one from 1917 and in the collection of Singer-Lauren. This is that little parrot done in these kind of very loud colors, quite primary and bright. That's the figure that he used as inspiration, sort of a knick-knack of theirs. And then here's another intermezzo from 1918, where we have an Asian, perhaps Chinese figurine that's placed here next to these books, with what looks like a textile, including a dragon in the background, and some kind of other decorative object, very likely it looks like here an urn or a vase. But he uses this very bright palette and heightens these tremendously. So unusual because after he does these still lifes, Singer will never return to it again. We don't know exactly why he did this, but I thought I would bring it along to show you the diversity of his work. And I think for him, it was something that sort of caught his attention. It may have been that he had visited certain exhibitions or was reading periodicals. This, we have to keep in mind, is during the war. But William did maintain quite a library. And that is a subject that we'll return to next time. This is an example of one of his much earlier still lifes from 1905, which is far more realistic, more in the tradition of the late American academic painters. Some have argued perhaps not as effective. I happen to like it. I like how the ceramics sort of fade into the background. There's a bit of mystery here, a little bit staged, but nevertheless, I like it quite a bit. You can see though, 1905, and here we have one of these Buddhist figures that's reclining in the foreground, evolves into this intermezzo of 1918. And then on the right, how that is sort of playing off of Doyavard, his friend's work, but their styles couldn't be more different. Doyavard's being much tighter. So William had started out with the idea that it would be more in the, if you will, the traditional sense of Dutch or European continental still life. But he moved in another direction. And that direction was immersing himself in the nature of Norway. During his later years, William would almost exclusively focus on these works, such as the one in the middle, that is a beautiful charcoal. We'll return to that in a moment. And the village at Alton, which is another one of my favorites in the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts collection. This painting for many years was on view in one of the corridors. It had a really nice sight line. At some point, I hope to get it out on view. I love how the light just shines down upon the village. It's almost divine or heavenly. And look at the pointillist application of the paint to the trees. Recalls almost the work of somebody like Georges Seurat. I'll show you a slide later where we have a good sort of comparison, or even Gustav Klimt, whose work you may be familiar with. I encourage you to explore Klimt's landscapes. Now, William Singer was not one for acknowledging who his sources were. He liked to see himself as an independent artist, one who had a personal style. He, as Helen Tretlin has convincingly argued, basically separated himself from the establishment of Norwegian artists, working between the 1910s and until William's death in the early 40s. But that doesn't mean that he didn't see work in Bergen or in Oslo or other parts of Europe. Beginning in the 1930s, the first set of works by William Singer entered the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts collection. They include the piece of Sleeping Nature, done between the late 1920s and early 30s. Great painting. If you are able to come to the museum, it is on view in the Grow Gallery corridor. Occupying quite a prominent place was a gift of R. Bruce Carleton, who was a jeweler in Hagerstown. The business still survives today, although it's under different ownership. Carlton, that actually is a typo. It should be Carlson, R. Bruce Carlson. And Carlson actually was the donor of this painting, and he was a friend of the Singers. On the right, we have a painting called Valley with Trees, which was subsequently donated a number of years later in the late 1950s. And this is really quite a beautiful painting. And as I had explained before, he used pastel a lot, William. And this was something that he liked to do as sort of a study, a preparation for something bigger. He would often create the pastels and oils on panels as sort of his sketches to work out larger compositions. The winter was also a favored theme. Look at the village down below on the lower left, and also the depiction of the clouds. This is really a lovely painting. I love how the road sort of leads down there, makes you wonder exactly where it goes below the horizon line there. But note the focus on the trees, even though we have different seasons. There is Singer sitting down next to one of the rivers, very close to Alton, and there he is sketching away on one of his panels, right next to the river. So he would go out into nature and work plein air, as they say. The first group of works, apart from the painting donated by Carlson, was, that actually is R. Bruce Carson Jewelers. The name there got a little bit jumbled, so I want to make sure that's correct and not mistaken. Calendar illustrations that came to us in 1932 and donated by the Singers. The idea of this is that it would help promote William's work, and specifically that he would be able to depict the different seasons. He had this calendar created by and produced by Boefa in Amsterdam, and it shows the various months. It's all 12 of them. And originally these compositions were done, as they say, en grisaille and black and white, so they could be more easily reproduced in an era before you still had extensive production of color images. So you have here January 1st through the 8th of 1927, and the calendar was for the year 1927. They're very subdued. They aren't very big. They're about this big, and it was produced as a calendar. With this image on top, and then the days below. The titles being the actual dates. But these would serve as the basis for later compositions. Interestingly, like William Singer, Claude Monet actually went on a trip to Norway in the 1890s, and he painted some important subjects there, such as Kolsås Mountain, which he became fascinated by. And as I recall, I believe Monet's son was staying there, and he wanted to visit him, and that's where this originated. But what I like to point out is that Singer's influences are multiple, and whether or not he knew of Monet's Norwegian compositions, I'm not certain, but I find this to be quite intriguing that we have two artists working in an Impressionist style and who look at some of the same subjects. Not to say that Singer was directly looking at those, but here we have The Mist in the Morning Sun from 1921. Some of my favorites of his nocturnal series include Northern Light of 1929, Northern Light and Moonlight, also from the same year, and A Winter Night. These are really stunning because of the way that he depicts the light of the constellations, how it makes the village glow. And look at how the light in the windows here of this building also reflect off the water. It is likely that he did these back in his studio, and he may have gone out and made some sketches at night Of course, he wouldn't have been able to have a lantern, but if the sky were illuminated enough, because sometimes the northern lights do get that bright, it is possible he may have just had enough light to be able to do something outdoors. But of course, with all the oil paints and everything he would have needed to finish in his studio. I find these fascinating. They're very spiritual too. And I'd like you to keep that in mind because Singer had a particular philosophy about art. And it was one in which he believed that the artist should try to depict a mood, not what you see exactly in front of you. And for him, art was really about a personal relationship between the maker and nature itself. He was trying to evoke those emotions, those feelings that are found deep within nature and make them apparent in the canvas or whatever work he was producing. That's what was important to him. And when we look at Singer's library, his books have a lot of things, a lot of works authored by such famous writers as Thoreau and also Ralph Waldo Emerson, who advocated this establishing this important relationship and connection between humanity and nature. And this is something that William really tried to delve into. And specifically, he described by saying, and I quote, "Each affected me," in terms of talking about these moods, "each affected me and could be best expressed according to the dream vision held within me." What he tried to show here was an ideal scene that he perhaps wanted us to sort of share with him. And that is certainly what we see here, this idyllic quality of the village of Norway. He repeats many of the same subjects again and again, but with different moods, with different light, with different seasons. But of all the seasons, winter was his favorite. And as you can see here, they sometimes have very atmospheric titles, like In the Shadow of the Arctic, from 1928. Another group of works would come to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts after William then died. He dies in 1943. They come to us in 1949 with the expansion of the museum. You're looking at photographs from that time when Anna Singer returns for the grand opening of the Singer Memorial Gallery. These are just some photographs. That's when the majority of work enters our collection. Works like this, the one I was showing you here, Christmas Eve on the left, or the very ethereal Net Boat of 1927, where he almost whites out the whole composition and shows us that single dinghy attached to the post. Just gorgeous as the snowflakes come down from the sky. The village at Alton, we talked about that before. Here are some photos showing the singers in having a casual moment here, probably near Alton, in a cabin, which they also occupied in another part of the country, located near one of the national parks, I believe up north somewhere, or to the east. Like the village at Alton, A Dreamy Summer Day also captures this aspect of ethereality, immersing oneself in nature. And look at the flowers here, just stunning. The expanse of the fjord and also this dock. Notice how we have no animals and people. It is homage to nature itself that fascinates the Singer. I had mentioned before he was very likely influenced by Georges Seurat. Well, here's Seurat's famous The Seine and La Grande Jatte in springtime. Seasonal moods, the application of those dots of pigments to the surface of the canvas. I think we definitely see some influence. And as we explored last time, Singer indeed stayed in Paris for part of his career. He also was influenced by the very gestural technique of his good friend, Walter Griffin. Walter Griffin being one of those artists with whom he worked in the Old Lyme Artist Colony, and all important, his close friend Henri Le Sidonie in paintings such as Fog at Noon, done before 1939. He also liked the autumn, with paintings in our collection like The Birth of a Cloud or Sun and Rain, where we can almost feel the mists and the humidity coming out of the sky. Atmospheric perspective just really amplified. And look at the color contrast there between the gold and the brown, and also on the left, In The Birth of a Cloud, the use of green and also those autumn tones, perfect for this time of the year. But the winter, it just captivated him. And he really delved into this in his series, including Norway's Golden Sun, The Dead of Winter, where we could almost, again, get the sense of that snowstorm. For any of us who've experienced the night with a blizzard, this is what this painting sort of brings to mind for me. It reminds me of growing up in New England and being huddled up near a fire, very cozy, or after the storm has passed, winter morning of 1931. And you can see the only reference really to human activity is the smoke coming out of that chimney down there in the village. This sort of crystallized quality of the pigments and of the snow and the ice really comes to mind here in Dream Harbor, or The Coming Storm of the 1930s. These are paintings, by the way, are all in our collection. Most of them donated by Anna Singer, some other donors here and there. During these years, Singer did get different art exhibitions, including an important one held here. This was, I believe, in the late 20s or early 30s at Frans Boefeld's Son's Galleries in Amsterdam, showing his Norwegian scenes and helping him to gain further recognition. In 1936, thanks to the Singer's philanthropy, they actually ended up sponsoring the construction of key roads and improving the infrastructure of Norway's road system. He was decorated with honors by King Haakon VII of Norway. And that shows William there talking to the king next to the king's car. And there's the cabin that I mentioned before. There's a good, nice picture of Anna sitting there, likely Hind Sæter, which was not far off from Alton, one of these places to which they would retreat. And William would go out painting. Now, we'll say in these years, William sort of goes through different periods of happiness and sadness. And this is really reflected in the later works. As was described in some of the letters, it seemed, particularly between Anna and her friends, it seemed that William may have been suffering from depression at times. One of the ways that he tried to cope with this was through art, and particularly paintings. One of my favorites of these are the compositions that he does of soul trees. Some of these are just stunning, just beautiful. Like these two on the left, where the white and the blue almost merge together. Or this one with the evocative title, An Old Viking from 1927, which is just really expresses a sense of melancholy and loneliness. But look at that quality of the pointillism, of the suggestion of snow falling out of the sky against almost ominous blizzard-like sky. Here we have the sun's last rays, which shows a very different kind of mood, much sunnier and happier. And the piece of sleeping nature that we saw earlier in the program. To Our River in Summer of 1924 and Summer Norway of 1930. Just gorgeous the way that the light shines down both on the river and also this mountain road. Beautiful contrast of the greens and the yellows. And it's really fun to get up close to Singer's paintings because, like a Georges Seurat painting, when you get up close, they're actually quite a variation in texturing of the brushstrokes applied to the surface of the canvas. And when you step back, it becomes a totally different composition. The Lone Tree would eventually evolve into other works that show more connection to spirituality, such as The Majesty of God's Nature, or When Winter Comes in 1929. But this idea of finding spirituality in God and nature is something that can be tied to such famous romantic artists as Caspar David Friedrich and his Oak in the Snow of 1827 to 28. Now, whether or not William was aware of Friedrich's work, we don't know. But it's very interesting and very tempting to think this because, of course, Friedrich is not the only one to do this, but it's he who also looks at trees specifically, trying to understand how their parts all work together. How can they be in certain ways anthropomorphized or connected to humans and human activity, or perhaps the structure of the anatomy of people but in this case of nature itself. How do the parts all fit together? I think for William, there's a little bit of that going on, but it's more about this tree as being a stable fixture in nature that fascinates him. But he too also, like Friedrich, looks at how natural formations, in this case a mountain, and Friedrich explored this too, is representative of God and connects to the human belief in the spiritual possibilities of nature and spirituality in general. God's Promise on the right-hand side here of the 1920s is also a composition that recalls romantic motifs in Friedrich's work, such as mountain landscape with rainbow, shown on the left. God's Promise being here a symbol of hope in the time perhaps that William was trying to cope with difficulties in his life, similar to the romantic imagination that we see over here on the left with Friedrich. See the rays of light coming up from nature itself, expressing optimism and a better future. During the 30s, William and Anna would continue to go back and forth between continental Europe and Norway, and friends such as Isidor Opsomer, the Belgian painter, would portray William. And here he is in a portrait we have in the collection in the center. Here are the singers and their friends. Opsomer is the gentleman right there in the middle. This is actually taken in Belgium in 1939 when the singers went back there and met with political officials and artist friends. Opsomer there on a distinguished photograph on the bottom. I'm very fond of this portrait. And so is Dr. John Richard Kraft, our director during the 1940s. Here he is when the painting was still relatively new acquisition. Now, once World War II comes, unfortunately, Norway is occupied by the Germans. This forces the singers to be placed under house arrest because they are foreign aliens abroad. This does not help William in terms of his depression, and he begins to work much less during these days. He becomes more reclusive and sometimes a bit more difficult to be around, but he still continues to produce paintings. And through all of this, Anna remained at his side. I should mention that. The stress of the war and confinement caused them to both spend time in the hospital, unfortunately. Anna will die much later in the early 60s, but it's William who's going to succumb to a heart attack in 1943. But William in these days, he still has his painting with him, and he creates paintings like Nature's Garden. Alone, 1940, a very sad title, or Olden Lake in Winter, from 1941, getting very close to his later years, again, where the white and the blue almost become a unified, harmonious whole. These compositions actually are really interesting to see the direction he was going in these last years. And as a whole, as I sum up this program, I can say that Singer's style really evolved over time. Doing this program has given me really an appreciation of his work, and it also gives me hopes that perhaps at some point our museum might organize an exhibition about his work in which we can go into depth about not only his paintings, but those of his contemporaries. And I hope to return to William Singer in a future Curator's Den and discuss how his work relates to his contemporaries. But next time, I invite you to join me for a preview of our newly installed Kirstein Gallery, which features the new installation of American modernism. And in particular, I will be talking about works ranging all the way from the early 1900s through the 1990s. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope that you have a good weekend. Take care and goodbye.